Sometimes everything begins with breathing, slow, deep, as if it were the very first. There are no words in it, no thoughts, only gentle presence, a light movement of air, a warm touch of silence, as if everything freezes, preparing to hear a story older than the most ancient legends. Imagine a world where there were no clocks yet, no maps, no famous books, only earth beneath your feet, the smell of warm dust after rain, the crackle of a fir in evening coolness, and the rustle of leaves echoing with the forest's breathing. In this world, different time. Here dawn comes not by schedule, but with the first bird voices, and night descends like a blanket, bringing peace with it. People then lived closer to the earth. Their fears were simple, as were their joys. They looked at the sky seeking signs, gathered around fires, listened to elders speaking of life and death. Their hearts awaited not answers, but meaning. Why do we suffer? Why do we age? Why do we die? And is it possible to walk this path differently, without pain? Somewhere in this world, among thick trees and distant roads, in silence broken only by nature's sounds, a teaching was born. It didn't come loudly. It wasn't accompanied by miracles. It didn't demand worship. It came like morning light through leaves, almost imperceptibly. It taught listening, looking, breathing. And now, centuries later, when the world has changed beyond recognition, this light still lives. Not in temples, not in books. It is in silence, in the simple feeling, I am. In each breath, in each step, in each moment. If only you slow down and allow yourself to hear. Close your eyes. Trust the voice. Everything else can wait. Now you are walking along a path that leads not to distant lands, but inward, into the depths of history, into the depths of yourself. And this road is gentle, quiet, real. Everything begins with silence, a barely perceptible whisper of wind, the touch of light on the earth's surface, the warmth of breath dissolving in cool morning. In this peace, where there's no need to hurry, no need to rush toward answers, space appears for a question. What is suffering? Why does it come? And is it ever possible to free oneself from it? Somewhere in ancient India, among dense forests and rushing rivers, in a world full of gods, rituals, and rigid castes, a child was born. He was named Siddhartha. His childhood was filled with luxury and peace, for he was a ruler's son, a promise of future kingdom. But beyond the walls of his palace stretched another world, a world of fear, illness, old age, and death. And when he first saw this, when he first realized the fragility and transience of human life, a question awakened in him, as ancient as existence itself. Why all this? Siddhartha left the palace. He departed, leaving family and title, leaving everything others knew about him. He became a wanderer. He roamed from one teacher to another, practiced severe self-restraint, exhausted his body, hoping to find truth. But truth doesn't come through suffering. It isn't hidden in deprivation. At some point, he understood. Truth lies somewhere between extremes, between luxury and asceticism. Then he sat under a tree. He simply sat and began to look. He looked within himself, observing how a thought arises, how desire comes, how fear passes through, how everything that seems important disappears. Hours passed, days passed, and one day, everything fell silent. Awakening came. He became Buddha, the one who awakened. But he didn't become a saint, didn't become a prophet, didn't create a religion. He simply rose and went to share what he had seen with others, with those who suffer, who seek, who fear, and hope. He spoke to them of four truths: that suffering exists, that it has a cause, that one can be freed from it, and that there is a path leading to this liberation. He didn't speak in complex words. He didn't demand worship. He spoke of mindfulness, of kindness, of understanding the nature of things. He taught observation, of breathing, of thoughts, of how the mind clings, how it fears, how it creates illusions. And those who listened to him grew in number. Some became monks, others simply listened. But all were united by one thing. They began to look within. Time passed. Buddha's teaching spread. It traveled through forests and deserts, crossed mountains, reached other lands. In each country, it took new forms, but the essence remained the same: a gentle view of life, acceptance of impermanence, the realization that suffering arises when we want everything to be different, and that, by letting go, we become free. Buddhism didn't become rigid dogma. It became a path. It doesn't need to be accepted. It can be tried. It doesn't require faith. It offers experience. And therefore, many who never called themselves Buddhists still follow its footsteps, in slow walks, in breathing, in the ability to simply be. Among different directions of Buddhism, different emphases appeared. Some taught striving for personal liberation, for a state where suffering no longer exists. Others said, "Don't hurry to leave. Help others. For when someone suffers, no one is truly free yet." And these ideas intertwined like rivers, joining in a great current of compassion, patience, and mindfulness. Buddhism passed through many trials, wars, exiles, oblivion, but it remained, because its root is in the human being, in everyone who has ever looked at the stars and asked, "Who am I? Why am I here? How should I live so as not to harm, but to help, so as not to fear in the end?" It doesn't give answers like a verdict. It only points to the moon and says, "Look for yourself." And the one who looks is already on the path. Sometimes this path seems very quiet. It's not like a feat. It doesn't require sacrifices. It begins with the simplest thing: inhale, exhale, awareness that you are alive, that you are not your fears, not your desires, not your grievances, that within you there is something greater: clarity, kindness, attention. And this isn't something distant. This is you, right now. Listening to yourself, noticing the world around. We begin to see how everything arises and disappears, how a thought appears and goes away, how a feeling comes and dissolves, how the world constantly moves, and in this movement, peace. Because, accepting it as it is, we no longer struggle. We simply live. And in this, freedom. Thus begins a path that has no beginning and end. It was always here. We simply weren't looking. Now we look, and we go. When Buddha left the place of his awakening, the sun slowly rose over the forest. Shadows disappeared, and with each step, it became clearer that now begins a path, not inner, but a path that requires words, meeting, touching other destinies. He walked not as enlightened, not as a saint. He walked as a person who knew silence. Along the way, he met wanderers, monks, merchants. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with reverence, as if sensing something elusive in him. He didn't try to convince, didn't argue, didn't proclaim truths. He simply shared what he had seen himself. Thus, he reached Sarnath, to the ancient deer park, where ascetics once studied. There, under spreading trees, in air filled with the scent of herbs and early morning, he first expounded what he had discovered under the Bodhi tree. Before him sat five of those who had once been his companions in severe asceticism, but turned away when he refused extremes. They didn't immediately believe, didn't immediately recognize in him the same Siddhartha, but something in his gaze, in the tone of his voice, in his silence between words, made them stay. He didn't say he had found God. He didn't say he was chosen. He said he had seen suffering and saw how it ends. First was the truth that suffering exists, that it permeates life like wind that touches everyone. Illness, loss, loneliness, disappointment, not as punishment, not as mistake, but simply as part of existence. Then, the cause of suffering, desire, thirst, the subtle, almost imperceptible clinging of the mind, which wants everything to be different, for the beloved not to leave, for the unpleasant not to come, for life to obey our expectations. This thirst, like fire, quietly burning within. The third truth, about the cessation of suffering, that the fire can be extinguished, that a state of peace is possible when desires lose their power, when the mind doesn't dart about, doesn't cling, doesn't suffer. And finally, the fourth, about the path leading to this peace. He spoke not of faith, not of worship, not of miracles. He spoke of practice, of what a person can do themselves, step by step, breath by breath, glance by glance. The five listened, and something responded in their hearts. Not delight, not admiration, but deep recognition, as if a long-forgotten truth had returned home. They became the first disciples, the first community, sangha. And from this moment, the teaching became not only inner experience, but a living stream, transmitted from person to person, through words, through silence, through presence. Buddha didn't create rules. He observed how naturally the desire to live more simply, more mindfully, more kindly arose in his disciples. He saw how, by refusing the superfluous, they didn't lose, but only became free. He taught them meditation, not as technique, but as a way of being. Simply sitting, simply breathing, simply noticing everything that arises, and not pushing anything away. Rumors of the new teacher spread like quiet wind. Different people came to him, rich and poor, noble and simple. Some stayed forever, others for a moment, but all were united by one thing: the desire to understand why in this world full of beauty there is so much pain, and how to learn to live without adding suffering to oneself or others. Buddha didn't demand renunciation. He didn't indicate who was worthy of the teaching and who wasn't. He said that truth is accessible to everyone who truly looks. And therefore, in his circle were monks and lay people, women and children. He spoke to each in the language of the heart. Once, after a long journey, he sat to rest by a well. There a woman saw him. She approached and offered water. He accepted with gratitude. She asked who he was, and he answered, "I am one who has awakened." These words were not pride. They were an invitation. Buddha didn't consider himself special. He believed that everyone can awaken, that with size everyone lives clarity. We simply too often forget about it, carried away by thoughts, fears, desires. Thus slowly, but inevitably, the teaching spread. But it didn't spread like an army, like power. It, like light in pre-dawn haze, like warmth emanating from coals, quietly, reliably, penetrating into the souls of those who were ready to hear. Some came with questions. What will happen after death? Is there a God? Is there a soul? But Buddha didn't answer everything. He said, "This doesn't help. What's important is not what will happen later, but what you do now. How you live, how you speak, how you think. If your life is full of hatred and greed, knowledge of the future won't free you. But if you live with kindness and understanding, the answer comes by itself." And this was the essence of his approach. He didn't build theories. He didn't create dogmas. He looked at life as it is and offered a path that could be walked, not for someone else, not for salvation, but for inner peace. Each morning, his disciples rose with the first rays of sun. They washed in the river, ate simple food in silence, collected alms, and their whole day was filled not with activities, but with attention. Attention to step, to breath, to word. They learned to be not perfect, not enlightened, simply to be in the world, not destroying it with their ignorance. Years passed this way. The sangha grew. Buddha didn't tire of speaking, and at the same time didn't tire of being silent. He knew that some truths cannot be transmitted through words. They can only be pointed to. And then silence becomes the teacher. In the evenings, when the heat subsided and dusk descended upon the earth, disciples gathered around him. They didn't wait for revelations. They simply listened, sometimes to speech, sometimes to silence. And in this silence, they felt that the path continues, that inside them, in the depths, something was changing, not suddenly, not brightly, but surely. And so, slowly, like a lotus blooming in morning dew, the teaching unfolded in people, in their actions, in their breathing. It didn't require force. It didn't fight. It simply was present, like peace among movement, like light among shadows. When days began and ended under open sky, when step became prayer, and silence, teaching, everything around became part of the path. Nothing was accidental. In every rustle of grass, in every glance, in every word, hid the possibility to see deeper. Those who followed Buddha soon began to ask how to walk this path, how living in this world full of noise and change to remain in peace, not to get stuck in desires and fears. Buddha didn't give direct commands. He spoke as if leading by the hand through fog, showing the outlines of a road that each must walk alone. He described a path he called noble, not because it is difficult or high for the chosen, but because it leads to inner freedom. This path, like an 8-pointed star, where each ray leads to the center. It began with right view. This didn't mean seeing the world in a certain way, didn't mean believing in this or that. This meant understanding. Everything changes. Everything is impermanent. Everything is interconnected. To see suffering and see where it comes from. This was not knowledge, but deep recognition of the world as it is. Then, right intention, not as goal, not as dream, but as direction of the heart. Intention not to cause harm, not to lie to oneself and others, not to live under the power of greed and hatred. This was inner resolve to move toward light, even when it's dark around. Next came right speech, words like the soul's breathing. They can heal and destroy. Buddha taught speaking gently, honestly, without malice and gossip. He said, "Let every word be like water in the palm, pure, clear, and full of care." After, right action. Not great deeds, not feats, but simply, not killing, not stealing, not causing pain, living so that your trace doesn't wound the earth, but comforts it. Then, right livelihood. Buddha didn't reject work, didn't demand poverty. He said, "Let your life be supported by what doesn't cause suffering to others. Let your labor be clean. Let bread come not through lies and violence." Right effort, not tension, but inner care. This is like a garden, watering good thoughts, removing weeds of hatred, being attentive to what grows within, and helping the good to sprout. Right mindfulness, like a ray of light, noticing everything, how you walk, how you breathe, how you eat, how you look, not getting lost in thoughts, not hurrying, simply being here and now, in the body, in breathing, in this moment. And finally, right concentration. Not escape from the world, not oblivion, but calm, clear depth, where everything that seemed noisy becomes transparent, where the mind, like a lake without waves, and in this silence the sky is reflected. This path, not a ladder upward, it like a circle in which each part supports another. You begin with one and find yourself in everything. You practice speech and suddenly understand mindfulness. You observe breathing and suddenly feel how the mind becomes quieter. But the path, not only in what you do, it's also in what you understand. Here, Buddha began to speak of karma, not as punishment, not as retribution, but as consequence, like a seed that, once planted, will surely bear fruit. Karma, this is not a sentence. This is simply a law. Every action leaves an imprint. In thoughts, in the body, in the world. A word spoken with anger echoes with pain. A glance full of kindness heals. And everything we do, think, feel, weaves the thread along which we walk. Buddha didn't say, fear karma. He said, be aware. Understand that you are creating your road right now. But there was another moment. He said, karma, this is not you. You are not your actions. You, this is possibility. You, the one who can choose in every breath, in every moment. This means that liberation is possible, that it doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made. What matters is that you realize this now, that you can stop, look, breathe, and do differently. Liberation doesn't come suddenly. It's like morning, which gradually fills the night air with itself. First, light clarification, then warmth, then light. And suddenly you understand that there's no longer fear, no constriction, no desire to run away. There's simply you, in this world as it is. And this, nibbana, not heaven, not paradise, but peace. Deep, clear, like the silence of forest after rain, when nothing pulls, nothing presses, nothing holds. This is a state in which that very thirst that fed suffering disappears, and only pure presence remains. Not everyone reaches this way. Not everyone even understands they're seeking this, but everyone who takes a step on the path already changes themselves, already becomes gentler, more attentive, kinder. And this is enough, because the path, not in the goal, the path in each step. Years passed this way. Disciples practiced. The teaching became deeper, like roots of a tree growing slowly but reliably. And somewhere in this, among nature's sounds, among simple words and quiet dawns, a new view of life was being born. A view where there are no enemies, where even suffering, this is a teacher, where even pain, this is a reminder. Stop, look, live. When the forest filled with evening light, and wind brought the aroma of distant fires, Buddha knew the path is only beginning. His words, like drops of water on dry earth, awakened in people not faith, but remembrance, as if they weren't hearing something new, but remembering what they had always known, but forgotten. And in this recognition, silence was born, in which resolve to go appeared. The first disciples who sat with him in Deer Park became the foundation of something greater. They not only listened, they began to share, not to retell, not to repeat, but to share what they had experienced, their own understanding, which was born from practice, from silence, from simplicity. Sangha, the community of practitioners, wasn't created as an organization. It arose like a flash of light reflected in hearts. One person shared with another, another with a third. And at some point, even before the word Buddhism appeared, a feeling of common road appeared. People began to live differently. They refused riches not from contempt for them, but because they felt too many things obscure the real. They wore simple clothes from old fabric, shaved their heads, walked barefoot, carried with them only a bowl in which they accepted alms, and each of their days was not a mission, not a trial, but a reminder that the path is not somewhere in the mountains, not in a temple, but right here, in each moment, when you go with an open heart. They went to villages, not as teachers, not as saints, simply as people carrying peace with them. And residents felt this because calmness can't be hidden. It's visible in how a person looks, how they are silent, how they smile. And they began to ask. And the monks answered without haste, without pathos, as if sharing a cup of water. With each year, the community grew. New disciples appeared. Women appeared who wanted to follow the same path. And Buddha didn't reject them. He saw suffering doesn't distinguish bodies and faces, and therefore liberation should be open to all. Thus appeared the female sangha, a monastic community in which women, like men, could practice, deepen, awaken. Over time, Buddha began to transfer responsibility to disciples. He understood his body is not eternal. He didn't hold on to the teaching as his own property. He said, "Let every word be checked. Don't believe me just because I am Buddha. Look, check, feel, and only then accept." He taught gathering together. Once a season, during the rainy period, monks didn't wander. They gathered under one roof in silence and simple conversations, shared experience, purified the heart, remembered why they are on the path. Thus were born the first gatherings, foundations of future monastic order. There were no books, no records, only memory, only the living word. And therefore, the main practice became attention. Attention to meaning, to essence, to the root of words. People remembered not as students, but as those who listen with their whole being. And these texts, instructions, stories, conversations, began to be transmitted from mouth to mouth. And everyone who repeated them did so with reverent precision, as if transmitting light from palm to palm. All this happened not quickly, not like fire engulfing a village, but like a sprout slowly breaking through soil. In one village, then in another. Sometimes one person, sometimes dozens, but each time a living touch of what doesn't require proof, because it already exists in everyone who knows how to listen. Buddha accepted all who came with open hearts, and even those who first came with doubt. He knew there are neither bad nor good people. There are simply those who suffer. And if clarity appears in this suffering, the person will change, not from fear, not from guilt, but because they will see it's possible differently. There were also those who argued, who demanded answers to complex philosophical questions, who wanted proofs, miracles, power. But he said, "This won't help. Truth is not in logic, not in miracles. It in how you live, in how you see another, in what you feel when you are silent." He told them, if you see that a word causes anger in you, then it's not the word's fault. Look within yourself. Some left, some got angry, but there were also those who returned years later, with empty hands, with empty gaze. And then Buddha was silent. He simply sat nearby, and this was enough. With each year, disciples grew older. New generations appeared. Those who never saw Siddhartha as a prince. Those who knew him only as Buddha. And therefore, he increasingly allowed others to speak, teach, explain. He knew if the teaching is true, it won't disappear. It will find form. It will live not in words, but in hearts. And indeed, it began to live. In simple villages, in quiet huts, in morning conversations by the river, disciples became teachers. But no one called themselves chosen, because the teaching didn't make people higher. It made them gentler, more attentive, more alive. And so, without temples, without wars, without pressure, something great arose, not as a system, but as breathing, as a way of being in the world without losing oneself. Time passed, and the world changed like water in a river, always the same, but never identical. Buddha's teaching, transmitted from mouth to mouth, from heart, reached ever new lands. It passed through valleys and forests, through dusty paths and noisy villages. And in each place, it met a different view, different breathing, different perception. People who listened to the instructions were different. Someone sought peace and solitude. Someone wanted understanding and wisdom. Someone felt compassion for all living beings and couldn't pass by another's pain. And therefore, the teaching, remaining unified in essence, began to branch, like a tree whose roots are deep in the earth, and branches stretch in different directions, but are nourished by one life. Gradually, two different views of the path began to form. One, the path of elders, the path of those who strove for personal liberation. They said, if you purify your mind, if you break the chain of sufferings, you will no longer be born. You will reach Nibbana. This path was strict, simple, without unnecessary decorations. It resembled a mountain trail along which one climbs alone, carefully and patiently. It was called Theravada, teaching of the elders. Theravada preserved a form close to what was in the beginning: concentration, monasticism, meditation, life by vows. Everything was directed inward, toward silence, toward contemplation, toward cessation of desires. This path was deep and clear. It said, begin with yourself, purify your heart, and then the world will become different. But there was another view. Those who shared it felt the path cannot end with personal liberation, for there is still so much suffering in the world. How can one go into peace knowing that someone nearby is drowning? And then they said, we will remain. Even if we reach awakening, we won't leave. We will remain in this world to help others, not because we should, but because the heart cannot do otherwise. Thus appeared the path of the Bodhisattva, one who has awakened but remains for others. This view became the foundation of the Mahayana tradition, the great vehicle, spacious like the sky, where there is room for everyone. In it, not only liberation became important, but also compassion, not only peace, but also participation. Mahayana developed differently. It didn't reject meditation, didn't refuse inner work, but it added to this a heart full of feeling. In it appeared images, symbols, stories of the enlightened, of Buddha worlds, of miracles that don't violate laws, but simply expand perception. For Theravada, the path was straight and narrow, like a needle's point. For Mahayana, like a stream. In one case, departure to peace. In another, return for the sake of help. And both were true, because truth, not in form, but in intention. These paths didn't argue. They simply were different answers to the same question: how to live so as not to wound, how to be free without leaving others in shadow. And each chose according to themselves. In southern countries, where it's warm and there are endless rice fields, Theravada was established. In monasteries of Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, monks repeated ancient lines in Pali language, kept strict vows, sat in silence, looking at walls, at breathing, at mind. Their life was like a river without waves, like candlelight in darkness. There the path went inward. And in the north, in China, Korea, Japan, the history of Mahayana began. There the teaching became flexible, like bamboo. It took the form of local cultures, spoke in another language, but still carried the same essence: understanding, compassion, liberation. Here the path went not only inward, but also outward, embracing all living things. And among these branches, like aroma, distinguishable but elusive, hovered the very essence of the teaching, that everything is impermanent, that everything is connected, that everything can be understood. And therefore, the path could be both quiet and bright, both strict and free. Only one thing was important: to go. Some remained in solitude. Others preached. Someone meditated in the forest. Someone led conversations in the city. But all were united by an inner flame, not passionate, not burning, but warm, quiet, which burns within, illuminating the path not only for oneself, but for those nearby. And no one considered themselves above others, because in the heart of Buddhism there was no ladder. There was no peak to climb. There was only the path, and each step along it already part of awakening. The path of Buddhism, like a great river, continued its unhurried flow. It didn't hurry, didn't rush to conquer minds, didn't insist. It simply flowed, first in thin streams, then in wide currents. It reached ever new lands, carrying with it not dogma, not power, but silence. Where hearts were ready to hear, it sprouted. Where hearts were closed, it simply passed by, like wind that touches the face and goes further. When the teaching came to the mountains, where the air is thin and stars seem closer than Earth. It met the ancient land of Tibet. Here, everything was different. The sky was high and cold. Winds blew harshly. Spirits lived in every lake, in every stone. People here were hardened by solitude and height. Their spirit was free but needed direction, and Buddha's teaching, meeting their ancient beliefs, didn't destroy them. It embraced them, accepted them like an elder brother, and became something new. Thus was born Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle. It was called so not because of brilliance, but because of hardness and clarity. Diamond cuts all illusions. Diamond reflects light without distorting it. This form of Buddhism became a combination of deepest meditation and complex symbolism. In it were rituals, but each ritual was precise, like breathing. There were mantras, not just sounds, but vibrations capable of awakening in a person what had long slept. There were mandalas, most complex patterns drawn from sand, then to be destroyed, to show everything is temporary, even beauty. Tibetan monks studied long. Years went to studying texts, to memorizing words, to inner practice. They were taught not only to understand, but also to feel. They were shown how to control attention, how to dissolve ego, how to open the heart to the world. They meditated in caves, among snows. They repeated prayers until the world around ceased to be external. And all this was not escape, but return to oneself, to truth. Vajrayana was deep. In it was spoken of divine beings, but not as someone outside, but as qualities within us. Anger, this is clarity. Fear, this is energy. Everything can be transformed if seen from another side. Therefore, in Vajrayana, even bright images of wrathful deities didn't frighten. They reminded, power can be pure if not suppressed, but understood. And further, to the east, through mountain passes, Buddhism reached China. There it met wisdom as ancient as itself. Confucius spoke of order, Tao of flow. And among all this appeared the teaching of awakening. Here it became even subtler, even more imperceptible. In China was born Chan. It wasn't explained. It was shown. When a student asked about meaning, the teacher might point to a tree, or simply close his eyes, or answer nothing, because truth doesn't need proof. It simply is. Chan didn't reject texts, but didn't depend on them. It didn't build complex philosophies. It was like an infant's gaze, pure, direct. Here the teaching was not in words, but in presence. You sit. And this is already practice. You eat, and this is meditation. You wash a bowl, and this is awakening. Everything can be a door. Everything can be a path. Later, in Japan, Chan became Zen, even stricter, even purer. In Zen monasteries, there were no decorations, only walls, only floor, only cushions. Monks sat for hours, simply observing breathing. Mind, what's within. They ate in silence, worked in silence, spoke only when necessary. And this silent life became a mirror in which everything was reflected. Zen didn't seek meaning. It didn't seek purpose. It simply was. Sitting, breathing, seeing, and at some moment, insight, without warning, without reasons. Suddenly, the boundary between I and world disappears, between mind and body, and only life remains as it is. Zen teachers didn't strive for fame. They could be strange. One laughed without reason. Another might answer a question with a stick blow. A third answered nothing for years. But all this wasn't strangeness. This was precision. They didn't teach the mind. They taught the heart. And in all this polyphony of forms, from the quiet southern monastery of Theravada to the snowy peak of Tibetan retreat, from strict Zen dojo to street preacher in China, sounded the same bell. Suffering, not a sentence. Peace is possible. The path is open. Each of these directions became an answer to the same longing that lives in humans. How to be here, among this world, with its beauty and pain, and not lose oneself. And Buddhism, in all its forms, said, begin with silence, begin with observation, begin with breathing. It didn't require faith. It didn't promise rewards. It simply pointed inward. And the one who once dared to go began to notice. Inside, beneath fears, beneath thoughts, beneath everything accumulated, there is something calm, something alive, light that doesn't require a source. It simply is. Buddhism never sought power. It didn't build fortresses, didn't conquer land. Its weapon was silence, its message, compassion. And therefore, when it spread across Asia, it didn't suppress, but absorbed. It didn't break the old, but created the new, leaving roots untouched. It came like spring rain, gently, but inevitably. The first country beyond India where the teaching stepped was Sri Lanka. This island, surrounded by warm sea, was a place where the Theravada tradition put down especially deep roots. Here, according to legend, the teaching was brought by monks sent by Ashoka himself, the great Indian ruler who, having learned the sufferings of war, turned to peace and became a patron of Buddhism. In Sri Lanka, Buddhism became not just a religion, but a way of life. Here, ancient texts were preserved, copied on palm leaves. Here, monks lived in forests, among birds and rustling leaves. They carried the teaching not loudly, not insistently, but like a muffled song heard by those already ready to listen. And this song permeated temples, streets, prayers by rivers. People believed, but not blindly, but with trust born from simple observation of how life changes when you look within. From Sri Lanka, Buddhism went further, to Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. In these countries, where jungles combine with ancient stones, the teaching again took the form of Theravada. Here it became the foundation of culture, woven into architecture, into ceremonies, into daily life. In Thailand, for example, almost every young man at least once in life becomes a monk, even for a few days, to touch silence, to know himself outside bustle. In these lands, Buddhism lives not only in monasteries, but also in homes. In the morning, women carry food to monks. In the evening, read prayers at small altars. This is not ostentatious faith. This is life that has absorbed the rhythm of teaching. And when the word karma is heard here, this is not fear, not superstition. This is a reminder. Every action, like a pebble in water, and circles spread far. Meanwhile, on another path, Buddhism reached China. There, it met an ancient civilization already filled with philosophy and search for meaning. Confucius taught order, Taoism, following the natural, and Buddhism didn't argue with them. It simply sat nearby and began to speak unhurriedly, understandably, gently. It spoke of suffering, of desire, of peace, and the Chinese heard. But to be understood, the teaching began to change. In China, it became less ascetic. It became more figurative. Here appeared stories of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, of pure lands, of compassion stronger than pain. Temples became decorated, texts extensive. But all this, like a river that spreads wider without losing direction. It was here that Chan was born. Practice without reliance on words. Direct transmission beyond scriptures. Where morning tea drinking became insight. Where a tree could be a teacher if looked at without thoughts. Where master and student were silent. And in this silence, truth was born. Later, when the teaching crossed the sea and reached Japan, it became Zen. Here, everything became even stricter, even quieter. The Japanese didn't like excess, and Zen became an expression of their spirit, like an arrow shot without hesitation. Stone gardens, calligraphy, tea ceremony, all this became a form of meditation. Here even chopping wood or cleaning floors could be awakening. Zen monasteries stood among mists, among pines. Monks rose before dawn, sat in silence for hours. They were trained not for strength, but for clarity. They were taught not to avoid pain, but to observe it. And in this strictness, freedom was born, not as absence of rules, but as a site in which you are no longer a slave to the mind. Korean Buddhism also adopted Zen, but added its gentleness. Here the teaching became more familial, closer to the people. Here even lay people, living ordinary lives, could practice deeply, without breaking away from obligations, but carrying the same silence in their hearts. And in Vietnam, Buddhism united everything: Theravada, Mahayana, elements of local beliefs. It became like music in which different instruments sound, but all of it, one melody. Here Buddhism was both popular and philosophical, and one of the brightest voices of the 20th century, monk Thich Nhat Hanh, was born precisely here. His teaching, this is a continuation of Buddha's breathing. Simple, pure, quiet. He spoke of peace, of presence, of how each step can be a prayer if you take it with attention. Thus, Buddhism traveled across Asia. It took new forms. It spoke new languages. It learned to listen to different hearts. But in each place, it remained itself. A path to oneself. A path from fear to clarity. From desire to freedom. It didn't matter whether it was in a temple covered with gold or in a hut at the foot of mountains. It didn't matter whether the monk sang a mantra or was silent. All this was expression of one thing, life full of mindfulness, where each morning, like birth, where each evening, like letting go, where nothing is held too tightly, where everything moves and everything is calm. Sometimes, when night becomes especially dark and breathing stops in the chest, comes a feeling as if everything dissolves, as if walls disappear, thoughts slow down, and only presence remains, without words, without image, simply the feeling, I am. But who is this I? Where does the one who feels, who thinks, who looks begin and end? Buddha didn't give an answer. He suggested looking within, beyond images, beyond thoughts, beyond habits, looking without haste, without struggle. And the one who looked, sooner or later, encountered silence. In it, there was no center. There was no fixed I to which everything returns. There was only flow of sensations, perceptions, desires, fears. All this came and went like clouds in the wind. And in this movement, there was nothing to grasp. Buddhism says, there is no I in the usual sense. There is only a conditional aggregate, body, sensations, mind, intentions, consciousness. All this changes. All this is not eternal. All this depends on causes. And if everything you consider yourself disappears, changes, appears again, where then is the one who remains? This is not denial. This is liberation. Buddha didn't say, "You are nothing." He said, "You are not what you think about yourself." Because all pain, all fears, all sufferings are born precisely there, in the attempt to hold on to I, to protect it, to prove its significance. But if I, this is only wind in grass, only reflection in water, then suffering begins to lose power. From here arises the idea of emptiness. But this is not emptiness as absence. This is free space in which nothing is fixed. Emptiness, this is not nothing. This is nothing exists by itself separately. Each thing exists only because everything else exists. A flower cannot be without sun, without rain, without earth, without the one who looks at it. Everything is connected. Everything depends. Everything is one. This interdependence can be felt if you simply attentively observe breathing. Inhalation comes from where? From air that warmed in the sun, passed through leaves, through lungs of other living beings. Exhalation goes where? Into air that others will breathe. Even breathing doesn't belong to you. It is part of life's movement. And if you look closely at anything, at a cup, at a tree, at a word, it becomes clear. Nothing arises by itself. Everything is permeated with traces of everything else. And in this, peace. Because if everything is interconnected, then you are never alone, never isolated. You are part of the world's breathing. But the mind wants solidity. It fears when everything slips. It wants to say, here this is truth. Here this is forever. Here this is I. But Buddhism says, everything is impermanent. Everything changes. Not because the world is cruel, but because this is the nature of life. And in this there is not fear, but freedom. Because if everything changes, then pain will pass too, and fear will pass, and anger, and resentment, and doubt, everything, like clouds, will pass. No need to fight. You need simply to look and wait until the sun shines again. Impermanence, not an enemy. It is consolation. It says, nothing freezes forever. And this means that at any moment you can begin again, with each breath, with each morning, with each meeting. With this thought, Buddhism addresses the very heart of existence. It doesn't offer consolations. It offers seeing clearly, without illusions, without embellishment, but also without judgment, simply seeing how everything arises, exists, and goes away. In practice, this becomes especially alive. When you sit, eyes closed, and the mind rushes here and there, thoughts, one after another, memories, plans, doubts, desires. But if you don't cling, they pass, and silence remains, not as emptiness, but as pure space where you can breathe. Sometimes in this silence comes a feeling. Everything is right. Everything is in its place, even pain, even fatigue, even tears. Everything. Part of a great movement that doesn't need to be controlled. It needs simply to be lived consciously. And then consciousness becomes not an observer, not a judge, not a narrator, but a pure mirror. It adds nothing. It simply reflects. It doesn't deny. It allows being. And precisely in this state, real compassion begins to be born. Because when you stop seeing yourself as a separate I, you begin to feel others as yourself, not as other people, but as continuation of your breathing, your pain, your joy. Then another's suffering is no longer alien, and compassion is no longer duty, but natural response. Thus, philosophy becomes not reasoning, but life, not building theories, but living. Each step. This is philosophy. Each silence. This is understanding. And in this understanding, there is no pride. There is only gratitude for the possibility to see, for the possibility to be. Understanding emptiness, absence of fixed I, awareness of interdependence and impermanence. All this, it would seem, could be difficult. But actually, this is like removing a heavy backpack that you carried all your life, thinking that without it, you couldn't walk. And then, suddenly, it turns out you can, easily, freely, quietly. And so, walking along the road, you no longer hurry. You don't think that you must necessarily arrive somewhere. You simply walk. You look around. You notice how wind plays in leaves, how pebbles crunch underfoot, how life goes in you, around you, through you. And in this simplicity, deep understanding, nothing needs to be held. Everything already is. Time changes. The world becomes faster, noisier, more complex. Cities grow upward. Roads cross continents. Screens flicker in all rooms. People increasingly live not in moments, but in streams of information, expectations, plans. And in this stream, it's easy to get lost, easy to forget how morning smells, easy to forget how silence sounds. But the teaching born 2,500 years ago under the Bodhi tree didn't disappear. It didn't remain in the past. It came to the present. And it came not as tradition, not as religion, but as an answer to fatigue, to anxiety, to inner emptiness that isn't filled by things, success, or recognition. Buddhism in the modern world. This is not a museum artifact. This is breathing. This is space into which a person enters when it becomes too cramped. It doesn't promise salvation. It doesn't demand submission. It simply suggests sitting, closing eyes, and looking within. Thus, in cities, among offices and cars, meditation centers appear. People come there not because they became Buddhists, but because they want to stop for a minute, for a breath, for life. They are not taught to believe. They are taught to look, to listen, to feel. Buddhism meets with science, and there is no conflict between them. Modern psychology increasingly turns to mindfulness practice, not as something mystical, but as a method tested by time. Research shows breathing changes the mind. Attention changes the brain. Compassion heals. And Buddhism doesn't resist these discoveries. It smiles, because what is now called mindfulness was already called simply attention thousands of years ago. Simply being, simply noticing, simply not hurrying. This is not a new trend. This is an old truth that was waiting for the world to become ready for it again. Many modern teachers don't wear monastic robes. They don't live in mountains. They give lectures in universities, write books, speak in simple words. They don't place themselves above. They don't build cults. They simply share experience, how to pass through pain, how to breathe when it seems everything is collapsing, how to live and not destroy. Buddhism says, don't be afraid to be vulnerable. Don't be afraid to feel. Don't be afraid to be in shadow. Because precisely there, in the very depth of fear, you can find strength. Not the kind that breaks, but the kind that accepts, smiles, and goes further. Modern person, tired, overloaded, often lonely, doesn't always seek God. They seek peace, silence, warmth. And Buddhism can be this. It can be not philosophy, not religion, not system, but simply presence. It manifests in how you look at another, in how you respond to anger with silence, in how you hold the hand of one who cries and don't try to console with words, only to be nearby. This is also practice. This is also path. And in this new world, where everything moves so fast, Buddhism reminds, everything important doesn't require haste. The present comes when you stop, when you hear how the heart beats, when you feel how rain falls outside the window, when you don't try to become someone, but simply are. Buddhism today. This is both retreats in mountains and morning meditations in the bedroom. This is both sacred texts and poems on paper by the computer. This is both silence and word. It doesn't ask what you do for work. It doesn't ask what you believe. It simply gives you the possibility to be with yourself, without masks, without roles, without fear. It teaches breathing, teaches letting go, teaches looking into the world's eyes, not with anxiety, but with understanding. Everything will pass, and you will pass, and in this there is no tragedy. There is only movement, living, gentle, real. And even in digital space, where thoughts are carried away in endless feeds, where attention is torn between screens, Buddhism finds its place. Meditation apps, virtual retreats, podcasts with silence. People learn to close their eyes and open their hearts. And also, ecology. For Buddhism says, everything is connected. Humans are not above nature. They are part of it. When you cut a tree, you cut your breathing. When you poison a river, you poison your body. Compassion. This is not only toward people. This is toward the planet, toward a bird, toward a drop of water. And therefore, modern Buddhism doesn't deny technology. It doesn't go into forests. It comes to cities with the same message. Look, breathe, notice, love, not because you should, but because otherwise it hurts more. And in this new form, it remains the same. Light in fog, silence among noise. A reminder that beneath the layer of anxieties, beneath habits, beneath fatigue, there is still you, real, alive, calm. You don't have to be enlightened. You don't have to be perfect. You simply can be attentive to yourself, to others, to the world. And this is already enough, because precisely in this attention is born everything needed: peace, warmth, and the way home. When the path approaches completion, it doesn't always become quieter. Sometimes noise rises within, of questions, regrets, memories. But if you continue walking, without hurrying, with each step, it becomes easier, as if everything heavy begins to dissolve in gentle light. And you understand, it doesn't matter how much was traveled. What matters is that you were on this path. Buddhism never demanded holiness. It didn't ask to become someone else. It only called home. There, where you already are, where there's no need to prove, explain, defend, where you simply live. And this is enough. You breathe, and this is life. You look, and this is presence. You are silent, and in this is everything. Throughout all history, Buddha didn't say, "Follow me." He said, "Look where I look." He wasn't a god, wasn't a judge. He was one who once simply stopped. And in this stopping, saw how everything is connected, how everything changes, how in the very heart of suffering already lives liberation, if only you cannot turn away. modern person doesn't live in forests. They live among machines, among screens, among news that each morning brings anxiety. And in this world, it's even more important to know how to stop, to know how to simply be. Not in the past, not in the future, but now, in this moment that will never repeat. Buddhism doesn't indicate what's good and what's bad. It doesn't require confessions. It offers clarity. It says, observe. Notice what creates pain, what gives peace, what strengthens the heart, what closes it, and choose each day, each step. Sometimes the path seems lonely, sometimes empty. But in this loneliness, possibility to hear yourself. In this emptiness, possibility to be filled. Because when there's nothing superfluous around, suddenly what was always nearby becomes visible. Kindness, compassion, attention. They don't come from outside. They aren't given as reward. They were always in you. And then it becomes clear. Buddhism. This is not a set of texts, not images in temples. This is not belonging to tradition. This is not external form. This is inner movement. Very subtle, very quiet. But without it, life seems somehow not your own. This movement can be in any action, in how you brew tea, in how you wipe dust from a shelf, in how you listen to a person without interrupting, in how you don't respond with evil to evil, but simply let go. Buddha didn't teach being good. He taught being real. Because when you are real, kindness comes by itself. It doesn't require effort. It, like breathing, light, gentle, invisible. But without it, it's impossible to live. And when you walk down the street and look at passers-by, you understand. Each of them suffers. Each wants to be happy. Even the one who is rude. Even the one who is silent. Even the one who seems strong. And you begin to feel toward them not pity, but warmth, a gentle wish. May it become easier for them. May it become lighter for them. This is Buddhism, not in rituals, not in symbols, but in this inner touching. When you don't pass by, when you are present, when you are completely, calmly, with open heart. And with this, everything begins. With awareness, everything is already here. Everything needed is not in the future, not in others, but in you. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are like sky, sometimes covered by clouds, sometimes cloudless, but always sky. And when you sit in silence, when you close your eyes and listen to how the heart beats, you begin to remember everything, yourself, the world, even if briefly, even if not completely. But this is enough, because awakening doesn't resemble thunder. It, like a light touch of wind, it comes when you are no longer seeking. And then everything becomes so simple. A glass of water, like a miracle. A window with rain, like prayer. Silence, like answer to all questions. You walk, and you don't know where, but you are no longer afraid, because the path is no longer outside. It is in you. It doesn't lead to a temple. It leads home. And when night comes, when the city falls asleep, and everything around plunges into peace, you feel everything was not in vain. All steps, all mistakes, all turns, everything, part of one movement that leads where there's no need to become someone, where you can simply be. And in this, all essence. Thus ends the path, but doesn't finish, because each day this is again beginning, again breath, again glance, again step. And all that's needed is simply to notice.